Somewhere in Escondido, California, in a barn behind an old farmhouse, there was a 1941 Willys pickup truck that nobody had looked at in over 40 years. The doors were sealed, the dust was thick enough to write your name in. The truck had been knocked off its jack stands at some point and was sitting in the dirt with its nose pointed down like it was trying to disappear into the ground. And the shoe polish numbers were still on the windows, still said 241, still legible after 4 decades. The lettering on the doors was intact. The blue plexiglass windows were unbroken. It was sitting exactly the way Mike Bamber left it in 1965, and the world outside that barn had absolutely no idea it existed. That truck is the Silver Dollar, and the story of how it ended up in that barn, and what it was before that, and what it took to pull it back out, is one of the better stories in California drag racing history. So let's get into it. We need to start with Mike Bamber, because the Silver Dollar doesn't make sense without him. And Mike Bamber is not exactly a name most people know, even if they're pretty deep into gasser history. He was born in San Diego in 1938 and grew up on the family farmhouse in Escondido, which back then was genuinely rural northern San Diego County, not the suburban sprawl it is now. Actual farmland. And by the time he was 14 years old, he had built his own car in the family barn. Not worked on one, built one, in a barn, at 14. That one detail tells you pretty much everything about who Mike Bamber was. By high school, he was already racing. The car was a 1940 Ford Coupe, and people around Escondido remember it as the quickest car in town, which, given what cars were running in the mid-1950s, meant he was doing something right. He had a Latham Supercharger on a small block Chevrolet and was reportedly running consistent 10-second quarter miles, which in a street-driven car of that era was genuinely serious. There's also a connection documented through a condolence comment on his obituary to the dragmaster team out of Carlsbad, Jim Nelson and Dode Martin, who were building dragsters and had a real presence in the SoCal scene, with a reference to Bamber receiving an award for longest traveled at the 1958 or 1959 Nationals in Detroit. I can't independently verify the exact circumstances of that, but it's first-hand testimony from someone who knew him, and it fits with everything else we know about his involvement in the scene. He raced that 40 Ford through 1959, and here's a fun footnote: that car still exists. It was exported to England and showed up at Sanapod Raceway's Dragstalgia event in July 2019, still carrying its original speed equipment. 60-plus years later, and the car he built as a teenager is still running around on a drag strip in the UK. That's a hell of a legacy for a machine most people have never heard of. But the Ford is the prequel. The main story is what Bamber built next. He traded an international pickup for a 1941 Willys AmeriCar pickup truck, and that transaction is where everything we're actually here to talk about begins. Now, real quick on the body style, because this matters, he didn't start with a Willys coupe. Almost every famous Willys gasser you can name ran a coupe body. The Stonewoods and Cook car, Big John Masmanian's car, the Bones Dubach Pisano car, coupes everywhere you looked. The pickup body was rarer in competition, and that distinction would end up being part of what made the Silver Dollar visually memorable, even in a field full of wild machinery. Bamber started building around 1960. One source puts the date as early as 1957, but that conflicts with the Ford's timeline. He was still racing it in '59, so 1960 is the more plausible start. He built the thing the way he built everything else, in his garage, with a few friends, reportedly with a lot of beer. No factory backing, no sponsor money, no team of engineers, just an electrician from Escondido who knew how to figure things out. The foundation was a Willys AmeriCar pickup, which even stock is a short, compact little box of a vehicle. Add a straight axle setup, jacking the nose way up in the air with the back end low and the power ready to slam weight rearward, and you start to understand what this thing looked like staged on the line. But before we get to how it ran, let me walk through what Bamber actually built, because the engineering decisions are genuinely interesting. The engine started as the same small block Chevy setup he'd been running in the Ford, initially with the Latham Supercharger transferred over. The final configuration that the Silver Dollar ran in its competitive years was a Chevy small block bored and stroked from the stock 283 out to around 340 cubic inches, running a GMC 671 blower sourced through a guy named Larry Bowers with a Hillborn 4-port fuel injector on top. So a Roots-type positive displacement supercharger stuffing pressurized air into a Hilborn injection setup. That's the combination. It's worth pausing on the injector choice because in the early 1960s you had options. Carburetors with blowers were common. Hilborn injection was well understood from fuel dragster applications. Running Hilborn on a gas-class car wasn't unusual at the top level, but it was part of a build philosophy chasing maximum efficiency at every step. Behind the motor was a B&M Hydro Stick, an automatic transmission that B&M adapted from the GM Hydromatic for drag racing use. The front suspension was a Dragmaster tube front axle, giving it that characteristic geometry where the nose sits way up high and all that weight transfer potential is loaded and ready. The rear end was an Oldsmobile differential running on the original leaf springs. American Racing magnesium wheels with M&H Racemaster 10.515 slicks out back. The bodywork is where things get really interesting, because Bamber didn't just take a stock pickup and drop an engine in it. He went through the truck methodically and replaced everything he could replace with lighter material. The hood came off and a Cal Automotive fiberglass unit went on. Then he fabricated, himself, his own fiberglass fenders, his own pickup bed, and his own floor panel. So almost everything you're looking at from the A-pillar forward and from the firewall back is fiberglass he made in his garage. The only steel bodywork remaining was the cab and the doors. 2 pieces. That's it. And all of that weight reduction got the truck down to around 1,800 pounds, which, in a class partly determined by the ratio of engine displacement to vehicle weight, is a massive advantage to chase. Here's where Bamber's weight tuning gets genuinely clever and also slightly absurd. He needed front-end weight for rollout stability, but wanted it as low and as far rearward as practical. So he took a 4-inch round tube, filled it with about 150 pounds of lead, and used it as the front bumper. He filled the stock gas tank with concrete for ballast. He ran a 150-pound tractor battery, because if you need rear weight and you need it cheap, a giant tractor battery is one way to get there. And he carried a full toolbox in the truck that he could adjust between events, add or remove tools, to fine-tune weight distribution. He was effectively using hand tools as calibrated ballast weights. Low-budget, creative problem-solving at its purest. The cockpit situation was dictated by physics and Bamber's own dimensions. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall. The engine was set back into the cab to shift weight rearward. Those 2 facts combined meant when you put Bamber in the driver's seat and reached for where a gas pedal would logically be, it was now on the passenger side. Not moved over slightly, the passenger side. The brake pedal was a lever with a pedal welded to it. The windows were blue plexiglass, not tinted glass, not clear, blue. You could see out, but everything was blue shifted, and at speed, with the sun at different angles, that would have made the whole world look strange and underwater. The truck was originally painted red and ran in some early 1960s magazine coverage in that configuration. I haven't been able to pin down specific issues, but multiple independent sources reference the period photo coverage. At some point, Bamber repainted it silver, and the name followed, Silver Dollar. Nobody documented why he picked that name, and Mike Bamber passed away in December 2014, so the origin is genuinely lost to us. Best guess is the silver paint, but that's speculation. So now we know what the truck was, let's talk about where it raced and who it ran against, because the competitive context is what makes the Silver Dollar's record mean something. Southern California in the early to mid-1960s was the center of gravity for gasser racing in America. You had Lyons Drag Strip down in the Long Beach, Wilmington area, the most important quarter mile in California during this period. Enormous weekly crowds, a level of competition that drew serious cars from across the country. You had Famoso up in Bakersfield, which hosted the March Meet and became legendary in its own right. The entire Southern California drag racing ecosystem was firing at maximum output, and the gas supercharged classes were the main event every weekend. Here's what you have to understand about A-gas supercharged in this era. The class was dominated by blown Chrysler Hemis, big cubic-inch Hemis with Roots-type superchargers, making power numbers that made scoreboard results look like errors. Stonewoods and Cook ran Hemis. Big John ran a chrome-plated 480 cubic-inch Hemi. The names you know from California's gasser era, Kohler Brothers, Junior Thompson, Shores, and Hess, all running massive Chrysler displacement. The Hemi was the correct answer in AGS, and everybody in the class knew it. Mike Bamber ran a Chevy small block. Not because he thought the small block was the better choice for the class, probably because he was an electrical contractor from Escondido, not a factory-backed team, and the small block gave him a viable path that the acquisition cost of a big Chrysler Hemi and all its associated parts might not have. But here's the counterintuitive part of how the class rules worked. Your minimum vehicle weight was tied to your displacement, so running a smaller engine meant you could either run lighter or had more margin on the weight side. Bamber understood this. The whole build philosophy, every pound of fiberglass fabrication, every piece of lead ballast, every concrete-filled gas tank was squeezing every advantage possible from the rules as they were written. Could a 340 cubic inch small block with a 671 blower really run with a 480 cubic inch blown Hemi and A-gas supercharged? Most of the time, probably not. The Hemi's torque advantage was real, and displacement matters when both cars are well sorted. But drag racing doesn't care about most of the time. It cares about today, and this track, and this run. And this is where the story gets interesting. In 1964, Mike Bamber beat Stone, Woods, and Cook. Let me put that in context. Stone, Woods, and Cook, Fred Stone, Leonard Woods, and driver Doug Cookie Cook, were not just the best gasser team in California, they were probably the best in the country. Their 1941 Willys Coupes, the Swindler A and Swindler B cars, are considered iconic. In a 2008 NHRA fan poll, their car was voted the fans' favorite race car of all time. Not favorite gasser, favorite race car of all time, against everything that has ever run down a quarter mile. That's who Bamber beat in 1964. One source calls it an upset heard throughout the gasser world, and I want to be upfront about the evidentiary situation here. The 1964 win is reported consistently across multiple independent sources, but I could not find digitized period race results specifically confirming it. Lyon's timing slips from 1964 are not sitting in an online archive. Drag news from that season is not easily searchable. For regional club-level competition from 60 years ago, the paper trail is thin, even for cars everybody knows. What we have is consistent reporting and no source disputing it. The win is plausible. SWC were great, but they lost races, and the people who documented the Silver Dollar's history were serious enough about accuracy to be credible. So I'm reporting it as something that happened, while being clear that the primary source documentation hasn't surfaced. There's another race that has a much stronger evidentiary basis because it has a living witness who confirmed it on the record. A car called the Speed Sport out of Tucson, Arizona, run by Fisher and Greth, lined up against the Silver Dollar at some point during the competitive years, and here's how that went. Somewhere in the run, Bamber's truck took a hard left. The Speed Sport swerved right to avoid contact. Neither car lifted. They both ran the full quarter mile in the wrong lanes, having essentially swapped sides somewhere in the middle of the track. Whether either driver was thinking about winning at that point or just trying to survive, I couldn't tell you, but both cars crossed the finish line, and neither one crashed. Decades later, when Chris Unger was tracing the Silver Dollar's history and tracking down the people connected to it, Red Greth came to visit the truck. He saw it, he remembered the race, and he signed the period photograph of the Silver Dollar in competition that Unger had found. First-hand confirmation from a competitor who was on the track that day. The race happened. The crossover happened. Red Greth put his name on the photograph. So that's what the Silver Dollar was doing in competition, running in the best class at the best track in California, beating teams with more money and bigger engines, and doing it with a small block Chevy in a pickup body that an electrician built in his garage. And then 1965 happened, and the whole thing fell apart in 2 acts. Act 1, Bamber blew the engine at Lyons. Out there in Long Beach on the strip he'd been running since the car was built, the motor let go. And that was the end of the season. He towed the Silver Dollar back to Escondido and came home with a plan. He was done with the small block. He'd proved he could compete on those terms, but the Hemi boys had the displacement advantage, and if he was going to keep going, he was going to go on equal terms. He got himself a 450 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi. He was going to do the swap and come back with the right motor. He didn't make it to the swap. Act 2 is where the story goes from hard luck to genuinely absurd. A woman driving a Nash automobile lost control of it and drove through the wall of Bamber's garage. The Nash hit the Hemi engine he'd acquired for the transplant. The Hemi got knocked into the Silver Dollar, the truck took the hit and got dented, and the aluminum air scoop that had been sticking up through the hood, one of the Silver Dollar's most distinctive visual features, went with the insurance claim. The Hemi went with the insurance claim too, and Mike Bamber, who had just watched a complete stranger's car come through his garage wall and destroy his racing plans, was described by people who knew him as being sick over it. He patched the garage wall, he rolled the Silver Dollar into the barn behind his mother's house, he closed the door, and he never raced again. I want to talk about Mike Bamber's life outside racing here, because understanding who he was makes the barn make sense. After his father had a stroke, he left college and took over the family electrical contracting business. He ran Bamber Electric as president from 1958 to 2000. In 1975, he co-founded a local bank called the Bank of Commerce. He was married for 37 years. He had 4 children. By every available account, he was a substantial member of the Escondido community, someone who put his family and his work ahead of everything else. Racing had been part of his life since he was 14 years old, and it ended in a barn in 1965, and he moved on. The Silver Dollar sat there, 42 years. Think about the span of that. The moon landing happened while that truck was in the barn. Watergate, the bicentennial, Reagan, the Berlin Wall, the Internet, September 11th, 2 wars in the Gulf, the financial crisis. 42 years of American history rolled by, and a 1941 Willys pickup with shoe polish on its windows and the original race lettering still on its doors was sitting in a dirt floor barn in northern San Diego County. Nobody looking at it, nobody thinking about it. Just sitting there. The person who eventually pulled it out was Chris Unger, and his connection to the Silver Dollar is almost its own story running parallel to the trucks. Unger was 13 years old when he moved to Orange, California, and his older brother started taking him to the races. Somewhere in those early experiences of standing in the grandstands, watching gassers come off the line, he heard the rumor, an A-gas Willys in a barn somewhere in Escondido. Owner was an electrician, details sketchy, but the idea lodged somewhere in his head, and it never left. He tracked Bamber down eventually. The 2 men became friends. Unger worked for a time as an apprentice at Bamber Electric. He was inside the man's business for years. And through all of that time, he knew the truck was in the barn and wanted it, and waited and asked, and probably asked again. And Mike Bamber said not yet for years and years. Patience that most people don't have. The first time Unger actually saw the Silver Dollar came by accident. He was at the property for some other reason, and Bamber opened the barn door for the first time since the garage crash. And there it was, sitting in the dirt exactly where it had been left in 1965, nose down because it had been knocked off the jack stands at some point during 4 decades of nothing. Unger saw what he'd been thinking about since he was 13 years old, and then the door closed again. It still took more years before he owned it. Around 2007 or 2008, Bamber finally made the call. He wanted to sell, and he wanted the money to build a Dearborn Deuce Roadster. The Silver Dollar was going to fund his next project, and Unger, who had been patient for literally decades, finally got his truck. Here's what they found when they actually got into it. The truck was in better shape than you might expect for something that had been sitting on its nose in a barn since Lyndon Johnson was president. The body was there. The entire original build was there. The steel cab and doors still solid. The fiberglass pieces Bamber had made by hand still intact. California's climate had been kind to it. The B&M transmission in the car, the front axle, the rear end, the blue plexiglass windows unbroken, the original lettering, the shoe polish number 241 from the last race at Lyons still legible on those blue windows. A period photograph of the truck in competition, front wheels way up in the air, was still in the car. What was missing was the engine. The final Chevy small block setup was gone, blown at Lyons in 1965, and presumably disassembled or disposed of at some point in the intervening decades. And the aluminum air scoop had gone with the insurance settlement after the garage crash. Those were the 2 main gaps in what was otherwise an intact Survivor. Unger made a smart call about what to do with it. He didn't do a full restoration. That would have been wrong, and he knew it. What he did was have the engine replicated to the final racing configuration. Larry Rowenhurst at Santa Ana Speed Center built a GMC 671 blown small block to match what the truck had run in competition. The headers were reproduced by Jose Palito. Dennis Webb fabricated a new aluminum air scoop to replace the one lost in 1965. Everything matched to what the car actually was, not what someone thought looked cool in 2008. The Silver Dollar ran at the 2009 California Hot Rod Reunion at Famoso Raceway in Bakersfield. And if you know the geography and history of where this car competed, that is about as right as you could get for a reappearance. Famoso was one of the Silver Dollar's home tracks. Coming back there 44 years later with the replicated engine and the original body and the shoe polish still on the windows was a good moment for a car that had been completely forgotten for almost half a century. From there, it went to Barrett-Jackson's Scottsdale auction in January 2011, lot 1260.4, listed as the 1941 Willys Americar Silver Dollar drag pickup. The sale price is behind Barrett-Jackson's paywall. It subsequently turned up at High Speed Customs in Tucson, where it was listed as sold. There are photographs of it at what appears to be a 2019 California show event, suggesting it's still out there being displayed somewhere. The current owner is not publicly known. So let's talk about what this car actually means and why it's worth an hour of your time, even if it never won a national championship. The cars that get remembered from the California Gasser Wars are almost always the title cars, Stone Woods and Cook, Big John Masmanian, cars with factory connections or national event victories or sustained magazine coverage. The Silver Dollar was none of those things. It was a regional car, an owner-built car, an electrician's car. It competed against the best and occasionally beat the best, and then it vanished. That profile describes the majority of cars that actually filled the Gasser class in the early 1960s. For every Stone Woods and Cook swindler, there were dozens of Silver Dollars, serious regional competitors built by working people with real jobs and limited budgets and genuine passion for the sport. They don't get written about. Their race results don't get archived. Their timing slips are in someone's attic or gone entirely. The history of drag racing, as it's usually told, is the history of the top tier. The Silver Dollar is the history of everyone else who made those classes exist. Bamber, running a small block Chevy against blown Hemis and competing seriously at Lions, is legitimately interesting as an engineering story. He understood the weight-to-displacement rules well enough to exploit them. He built fiberglass body panels by hand to get his weight down. He used a lead-filled bumper tube and a concrete ballast tank and a tractor battery and a toolbox to dial in weight distribution. He put the gas pedal on the passenger side because the physics of his build demanded it. None of that is factory engineering. That's one guy in a garage figuring it out with what he had. The 1964 defeat of Stone Woods and Cook, if it went down the way it's been reported, is the kind of result that a factory-backed team would have turned into promotional material within a week. Bamber was an electrician from Escondido. He probably drove home satisfied with a good day and went back to the job on Monday. There's also the survival angle, and I don't want to gloss over what that actually represents. The attrition rate for cars from this era is brutal. They get cut up for parts, they get crashed and scrapped, they get modified beyond recognition chasing the next class, they get used as donors, they rust in wet climate fields or get turned into trailer art. The fact that Bamber put the Silver Dollar away intact, partly out of heartbreak over the garage crash, partly just because that's what he did, and that it sat in a dry California barn rather than an eastern field, and that the fiberglass he had personally fabricated held up structurally for 4 decades. All of that was luck and circumstance and geography, and it resulted in a car coming out of storage as a genuine historical document rather than a pile of rot. The shoe polish numbers are still on the windows. Sit with that for a second. That's Bamber's handwriting from 1965. He wrote 241 on those blue plexiglass windows before his last race at Lions Drag Strip, and nobody touched it for over 40 years. When Unger finally got those windows out of the car, they were still reading the literal last thing Mike Bamber wrote on his race car before he closed the barn door and walked away from drag racing. The broader picture is worth a moment because the Silver Dollar doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in the middle of the Southern California drag racing scene at what may have been its all-time peak. Lions Drag Strip in the early 1960s was one of the most important sports venues in Southern California, full stop. The weekly crowds were massive, the racing was elite, the atmosphere was electric in a way that professional drag racing doesn't really replicate anymore. Everything was closer, the cars were more accessible, you could walk through the pits and look at what people had built. The Silver Dollar was part of that world every weekend it competed. The gasser class was in a golden moment that wouldn't last. By the mid-1960s, factory teams were getting into funny car development, which would redirect enormous amounts of talent and money and attention. The pure gasser class never went away entirely, but the specific window, the confluence of technology and rules and culture and geographic concentration that produced Stone Woods and Cook and Big John Mosmanian and the Silver Dollar all running at Lions on the same weekend, that window opened for about a decade, and then it changed. Bamber walked away in 1965, right as that era was beginning to shift. He didn't get squeezed out by changing rules or better-funded competition. He got squeezed out by a blown motor and a woman in a Nash who drove through his garage wall. That's drag racing sometimes. You do everything right, and the universe has other ideas. The thing about Bamber that I keep coming back to is this. He built his first car at 14. He built the Silver Dollar in his mid-20s. He ran it against the best competition in California and beat the best team in the country at least once. Then he put the car in a barn, went back to his electrical business, co-founded a bank, raised a family, and lived another 50 years. No interviews about the Silver Dollar, no reunions, no war stories or circuit. He just lived his life, and the truck was in the barn, and that was that. Chris Unger spent decades trying to get his hands on that truck, actual decades. He became Bamber's friend. He worked in his business. He waited. And when Bamber finally decided to sell, it was to fund his next build, a Dearborn Deuce Roadster, because even in his late 60s or early 70s, Mike Bamber was still planning his next project. The car builder never left, he just redirected. He died before that Roadster was finished, December 2014. He was 76 years old. His family described him as passionate about life and how it should be lived, and based on everything in the record, that tracks exactly right. He was the kind of person who looks at a stock Willys pickup and thinks, I could race that, who fills a gas tank with concrete for ballast, who puts the gas pedal on the passenger side because the physics left no other choice, who trades a truck for a truck and builds something that can beat Stone, Woods, and Cook, and then closes the barn door and moves on. The Silver Dollar turned up at a show in California in 2019 based on photographs that surfaced online, 54 years after it went into that barn. The blue plexiglass windows were there. The lettering was there. I don't know who owns it right now. Current ownership is not public information. Somewhere in California or Arizona, most likely, somebody has a 1941 Willys Americar pickup with shoe polish numbers on its blue windows and a story that runs from 1960 to 1965 in the Gasser Wars at Lions Drag Strip and then goes dark for 4 decades before coming back exactly the way it left. That's the Silver Dollar. Not a championship car, not a factory effort, not a magazine cover regular. An electrician's truck built in a barn that competed at the highest level of its class and beat the most famous team in drag racing at least once, and then went into storage for 42 years and came out intact. There are probably other Silver Dollars out there right now. Coupes and trucks from the Gasser era, built by people nobody wrote about, competing at tracks that are parking lots now, waiting in barns that nobody's opened in a long time. Most of them are going to stay lost. This one got found because one patient enthusiast never stopped asking, and because Mike Bamber put it away instead of cutting it up, and because a dry California barn is a lot kinder to fiberglass than most alternatives. The Gasser era produced some legendary cars. The Silver Dollar isn't one of the ones in the books. It's the kind you find in barns, and somehow that feels exactly right.